And we're going to start to ask the next panel to come up. We're going to have our academic and industry panel join us on stage. And we're also going to ask Dr. Govind Srimathveeravalli to join us, who's going to basically provide us our moderation for this session. Dr. Srimathveeravalli is supported by grants from the National Institute of Health and the Department of Defense, and he focuses on developing drug delivery technology. And we're pleased to have him join us to moderate our industry academic panel. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is the first time I've been said to be moderate about anything. It's usually not the case. So it's my pleasure to moderate this panel. And I'm going to start off by...
They can't hear you.
Can you hear me better now? Mic check. Someone in the back. Can you hear me better now? All right. Thank you. We're going to start off with a quick introduction. So we're going to have all our speakers introduce themselves. And there is an icebreaker question. I'm asking the speakers, if you had a time machine and 5 minutes with your past self, of all the things, what professional matter would you discuss with them? So,
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. My name is Mary Erslon. I get my own microphone here. I'm a master's prepared nurse that entered industry about 24 years ago. And so similar to what Joanne was just saying, you can impact several patients or you can impact a lot of patients. And to me, that's what industry really has presented that opportunity for me. In terms of what I would tell myself, I guess I would tell myself and all of you not to forget to care, not to forget to care about humanity. And as we enter into a realm where there's so much remote work, so much robotic, so much distance learning, all of those things, don't forget about the human element. And that to me is what I try and think about every day.
Thanks. Thank you. A lesson in audio equipment. These are unidirectional mics, not omnidirectional mics, so, so everybody knows. So my name is Steve Weisner. I run Nihon Kohden Innovation Center, early stage research in medical devices. And what would I tell myself if I came back, could visit myself in the past? Well, first I'd probably say don't go into management. It's not as much fun as engineering. But actually I designed a GUI element yesterday, so you still can do a little bit of engineering. But I guess the thing that I would really focus on, especially sort of my engineering background, is live in the space, basically. In other words, don't come in with an engineering solution. Live in the space, appreciate the space, understand. We talked earlier in an earlier session just about, like, for instance, patient flow, workflow, and the nurses kind of live and breathe this. And so understand that space. Then there's plenty of time later to talk about the technology.
Hi, everybody. I'm Neal Wiggerman. I'm an industrial engineer by background, so I enjoyed some of your comments, Joanne. And I have a PhD from the University of Michigan specializing in ergonomics. I work at, well, I started at Hillrom 11 years ago, and now we're acquired by Baxter. We have a biomechanics lab, work with R&D as well as marketing and doing original research, and have another PhD here in the room who is a UMass alum, so who works in the lab. So I guess, and I do have to say I'm on the board of the Association for Safe Patient Handling Professionals, so if you have questions about safe patient handling, I was very excited also about your ceiling lift story. But I guess what I would tell myself if I'd go back would be that when I was young, I thought they were very strict jobs. My parents were teachers. I thought there's engineers. People have very defined roles, and some executive decides what those roles are going to be and how many there are. But at least for some of us fortunate enough to go to college, and even for some that haven't, sometimes you find roles are dynamic, and you find the place in the organization where you can be more effective. And 100 people might do a role 100 different ways, but you're still serving the organization, your stakeholders, and your patients. So,
thank you, Neal. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Girish Gangadharan. I lead strategy and business development for Spacelabs Healthcare. We are a patient monitoring and diagnostic cardiology company. As part of my role, essentially, anything that is not conventionally done within the four walls of the company, involving other people, academics, researchers, companies, right, startups, our group generally tends to get involved. And the question that Govind asked actually kept me up all night because I couldn't figure out what I would tell myself, right? It's a very hard question to answer because you have a certain context and experience over time. And things which make eminent sense to you probably wouldn't make sense to you if you went back and spoke to yourself 20 years ago, because you don't have that context, which is why we don't understand anything what our parents say until we reach their age, and then we're like, now I get it. But the truth is, I think just enjoy and take pride in what you do. Healthcare, and we talk about it all the time, right? You actually do impact lives, no matter how indirectly. It's a very giving profession. I'm really proud of what I've been doing, regardless. And now healthcare is definitely on everybody's radar. But regardless of the appreciation or lack thereof, it's something that you should enjoy doing every day, right? You cannot say that about a whole lot of other professions, if you will. But again, like I said, I don't think I would understand myself if I spoke to myself.
Thank you. This panel is set up, I wish to do 3 themes, and I'll first pose a question, and each of you can take the opportunity to answer that question, and then we can discuss it a little bit, and then we'll transition to the next question. The first theme is breaking silos and building bridges. We start off with a question, what does industry wish that nurses and engineers understood about them or knew about them?
I'll go ahead and start. And I think I forgot to mention, as I was focusing on what I would tell my young self, that I actually led the medical affairs team at a division of Medtronic. So one of the things that I think is very important for engineers and certainly for clinicians to understand about industry is that it's not, as we have new clinicians that enter into industry, the first thing that they hear is that they've come over to the dark side. And I think it's important for everyone to understand that it's not. I mean, industry is full of clinicians. It's full of people the industry itself always has very important missions and values and objectives. They are very patient-centered. And I think it's very important to understand that it's not the dark side. It's simply an extension of what each of you do every day. And it's a very inviting and fascinating element of healthcare that is very important for us.
So I think they're complementary in the sense that my answer is that what I would really want the two groups to do or understand is nurses need to reach out and talk more. That usually isn't a problem with the nurses that I've dealt with in the US. I've had the good fortune of working with many, and I appreciate all the connections. But they need to reach out. It was interesting in the previous panel, I think it was only just briefly mentioned that, what if you have this idea or whatever, who would you reach out to? And nobody really just said industry. They wouldn't necessarily reach out right to industry. So, my point is they should reach out to industry. They should talk to the vendor. If the vendor isn't listening, they should talk more or maybe change their vendor. maybe not under the control of the nurse, obviously, but that's another interesting idea. And then on the industry side, it's a complementary case, right? Listening. So really understanding what it is, really, I think there's a natural tendency for engineers to jump to solutions and so on, and so better understand and listen, so that both the talking and the listening.
Yeah, and I think maybe I'd build on some of what you're both saying. I think it'd be great if academia and nursing, and students understand the design process. So when and maybe for a pragmatic reason, if a design or a product is not meeting their needs, to understand why and feed some of that back in. For designing a hospital bed, for example, we have over 100 design requirements, and we have opposing constraints, and a lot of, we have to have a hospital bed that works in a Navy ship and a patient's home and an ICU. And so, when a design does not meet a need on some level, it might be because of bad assumptions, and a better, I hope to talk more about how we develop those design requirements. But also, we will often get a request, can you add a button that does this, and not understand why that's so hard for us. But we do literally years of testing when we're designing products to make sure that button works right, it doesn't break, users use it in the way we expect them to use it, and that a user who doesn't speak English will get the same result as a user in a different country who has different expectations and different cultural, requirements. And so there is a lot of thought by a lot of people over a lot of time that goes into a product. And so if it's not meeting a need, the requirements might be, we can debate those, and that's where I think the conversation and the collaboration is so very important. And yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Completely agree with everyone in sitting on the bench here, and they have ample more experience, but I'll pick a contrarian view as well. Don't be afraid to push back on some of the constraints that we have. Because if you believe in it strongly enough, and if you think it's a big enough need, what happens is often we have many inputs. Everyone goes through their day-to-day. And we assume that just because we told someone at a certain time that they know of it and they're thinking about it, they're not actually. They might have forgotten because the next crisis came on the table. I think I'm looking at Joanna there. That probably happens every 15 minutes. But if you think it's important enough, keep pushing for it, right? If one partner is not seeing the value, go for another one, another one. As you go through that process, a couple of things might happen. One is you might find somebody who actually understands exactly and sees the value and is able to connect the dots and make that happen. Or you yourself will learn why that might be a challenge to actually go through with. Either way, you walk away with something, and it gives you a bigger perspective so that the next time you have this idea, you're starting to think of some of those challenges as well.
I have a follow-up, like a point that could be discussed more, which is one thing that academia doesn't fully understand is they don't understand the business model or where the money is coming from or going to in the industry. So to us, it is opaque, and therefore, it sometimes feels like the dark side because we think it's all about the money. Can you please elaborate on that?
I noticed that you picked me out of everybody, so fine. Might be a suit. That's a very interesting question. Actually, that's the answer I was going to go with as I put my notes together for this question. One of our clinicians in the team, right? She said, no margin, no mission. I never heard it put that succinctly. What she was trying to say was that if you're not able to keep yourself viable, then no matter how great your idea, it'll never go anywhere. And so one of the things that we struggle with is the long gestation period. The more revolutionary your idea, the longer it will take to pervade in the healthcare system, right? It's just, there's a natural inertia resistance to it, and don't underestimate the impact of that. Now, what happens is this, I have a financial background actually, so there is this concept called NPV. It's a discounting of money, right? If it's $1 today, it's worth $1.30 in 5 years, let's say. But $1 in 5 years is worth only 72 cents or something like that. And so what happens is, the longer and longer you push out that return, the smaller that pool of money looks. But the investment that you're putting is generally upfront, right? That's where you put most of the effort. And so what happens is that equation tends to start getting imbalanced really, really quickly the longer you push it out. Every year, every 6 months. And just introducing a system, I think my colleagues will speak to it, is just the beginning. You have to spend a tremendous amount of time trying to get it as part of the workflow, get the clinical evidence there, get your speakers and everyone else in place, your evangelists. And because of that, the gestation just becomes longer and longer. Now, COVID short-circuited a lot of that the last 2 years. But the systems are now slowly, and you guys can contradict me, are reversing back to what they were before. And so I expect that gestation period will come back once again. That's the challenge that you have in the industry. You put the money today, you may see a return in a few years, and it may not be worth that much. And when you start doing this through your financial committees and through your administration and others in the hospitals as well as in industry, you start to get a lot of pushback from finance and others. That's one of our principal challenges that we face.
Yeah, I would also say this kind of works both ways in terms of, the clinical staff, the clinicians understanding sort of the industry processes in terms of what we have to go through to sort of bring something to the market. And it's frustrating. I get it. I absolutely get it. There's knowledge on the other side, on the industry side. So I do early stage research. I make my engineers understand the reimbursement process for what they would develop. If they had it today, whatever they're working on, if it worked magically, then we go through an exercise where we understand how that's going to be reimbursed. And understanding the United States reimbursement system is, I tell people that I work for a Japanese company. They asked me to explain that to them, how our reimbursement works. And I told them it would be easier to explain one of Einstein's theories than to do that. So it's a challenge. So we, on the industry side, we also have to understand that process of what that works. And I would, challenge people to say, don't look at it initially. Rather do look at it initially, and don't look at after you've kind of produced it and now we got to figure out how it's actually going to be reimbursed and how is that going to work in terms of hospital financing and so on. And COVID introduced another element. It didn't quite introduce it, but it elevated another thing, which is home care. So there's a whole process of home care, obviously, that we could probably, Karen, have another panel on to discuss. But in that area, there's a whole different level of reimbursement and how that works. So.
Any other comments?
Just one other thing, and that's, budgets are typically, in industry, budgets are typically set a few years in advance. Strategies are set a few years in advance, budgets are set a few years in advance, and there's less opportunity for things like grants. There's those grants, NIH grants and things like that certainly do exist in industry, but for the most part, budgets are set, and so it's not as easy to shift course. It's not as easy to say, okay, well, this month we're going to focus on this and next month we're going to focus on that. So you may find some resistance to new ideas if that wasn't part of the initial strategy. So it's always trying to update the strategy and keep it fresh so that we can be innovative and shift course when things like COVID happen.
Thank you. Seems like a ripe opportunity for a healthcare economics course, which kind of segues to the next question in this theme, which is what professional or technical skill does the industry wish to see more in their nursing or engineering students?
Go ahead if you can.
Okay. So in industry, to see what our nurses should understand.
Extending the question to both nurses and our engineers. So what professional or technical skills that you wish to see more in the students coming out of our institutions?
So engineering, for me, somewhat easier answer in the sense that, so I have a biomedical engineering degree, and I'll tell you that maybe I have a slight bias. I would tend to hire biomedical engineers as opposed to just a software engineer. I was a software engineer, so I get that. But the point being is exposure to general physiology, understand, you don't have to have I could probably hold a conversation with a cardiologist now, but I couldn't do it when I first started. So I don't have that expectation, but I think understanding that basic level of physiology, and then probably maybe even more important, workflow, and we talked about that a little bit earlier today. And so one of the things, when I worked at HP Medical many years ago, they actually we had our first year, our new employees, new engineers, actually went through a program where they were in the ICU for 1 or 2 days. I think the OR was 1 day, ED, ward unit. I don't think it's long enough. I'm not saying that's enough, but at least get that exposure. So I think that was important on the engineering side, to have that basic science knowledge and then the exposure. I think the nursing side, I don't expect nurses to be experts in the technology, but I would argue that I think what nurses could bring to the table is usability. And I think everybody has a natural understanding of usability. It kind of works or doesn't work. But perhaps a little bit more of the formal understandings of how usability works and sort of how you break a problem down in terms of being usable or not. And that helps that language barrier, right, between the nursing and engineering.
So I can speak to that a little bit as well. Actually, I'll relate the dots in just a minute. Who here is aware of that September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month? Show of hands, please. Right, I know. I didn't know that either, actually. Only my colleague informed me that last week. The reason is she's really passionate about it, and so she talks about it all the time. That's her motivation. The second bit is, what Ellen was talking about, research. Because it's if you just wait to connect with somebody face-to-face and talk about a certain topic, a lot of opportunities might miss you by. One of the ways we identify people who are in the space or looking at the space is basically looking at the research. But in order to do that, after a 12-hour shift takes a tremendous amount of motivation. So find a topic that you're passionate about, publish about it, talk about it, attend conferences. There are local chapters of conferences that don't cost you much, right? You just drive and come back. And then spread the awareness of your topic. Again, if you feel passionate about it, follow through on it, right? But then you have to feel that much more passionate about it. That's the hard part. The other thing is on the engineering side, what we would wish, and I think you guys have already made a great start on that, understanding the clinical aspects better. So understanding how the clinicians actually use their products. Some of the best successes we've had is when we've had our brightest engineers just sit in the room and observe the clinicians sort of go about their work. And you can just see the dots connecting their mind. And they can't wait back to get to their desk because they've got an idea and they want to try it out. And some of our best innovations actually have come out of that. But that's not to say go native, right? Because you don't want, spend enough time in any role. You develop a set of blinders. You don't want that. What you want is perspective and paradigm change, shifts, but you don't want them to go native. We don't want you to think like us. We have our own blinders. We want you to challenge us, which is what I was talking about earlier as well.
I can address the nursing aspect a little bit. I think what every nurse brings to practice is already a sort of an innate sense of curiosity and passion, and certainly technical knowledge. I mean, that's a lot of what nursing is the science of nursing and the ability to do techniques. What I think nursing needs to bring to industry is really continuing that sense of curiosity, what I like to call the so what. So when you're doing a technique or using a device or seeing a side effect, really asking yourself, so what? And communicating that with your industry partners so that we know what needs to be changed. When you encounter a problem in practice, what needs to change, and also bringing that curiosity to nursing research, and understanding that most industries fund nursing research. We have big external research programs that typically fund a lot of research, and nursing research answers a lot of the questions that we need to know about. So it's great to have centers where such research is hosted and funded, but also you have the ability to write grants to industry just as you do to other funding bodies. And so I would really encourage you to bring those questions to industry as well.
Thank you. Any other concluding thoughts?
Well, I guess just briefly on the student aspect, I can't add too much to the nursing side. I'll say something that I think nursing gets right is coming out of school with practical experience. And a lot of engineers don't have that. Some schools, my undergrad, I was fortunate, had a mandatory co-op and internship program. A lot of schools I think would like to, but they don't have the industry relationships. And you know, I think I don't hire a lot of people, especially undergrads, but hiring somebody coming out of with an undergraduate engineering degree without any experience, you don't know what specialties they're interested in. They might not know. They might not even like engineering after they accept your job and work there a couple months. So, but you know, even more than that, a new grad in engineering, it's going to be a couple years before they get their legs. And if you can jumpstart that with a year of experience, you know, I think you're doing your school and your students a service.
Thank you. This segues into theme number 2, which is on communication. The first question is, how do we improve access for industry and engineers into nursing programs, in the sense that it's not just improving access, but if you can discuss specific models that you have seen succeed?
I know for us in my businesses, one of the things that we've done recently is, and we were talking about this a little bit about this at dinner last night, we've done day-long seminars to schools of nursing and schools of medicine on what it's like to work in industry. I think we were saying that sometimes if you had a whole semester on that, it might be too boring to do, or might be perceived as too boring, although it's not. But what we've done is create a curriculum for a one-day course where we sort of describe to students what it's like to work in industry, to give you an idea of what it's like to work with and work for, to sort of increase options for those who are entering a clinical realm or an engineering realm. And I think it's been pretty well received. It's expanding your network, certainly. And I guess the other thing is, I would not be afraid, if you have a contact with anyone within industry, I wouldn't be afraid to send out a blind email. We are typically very responsive to emails, and if we are not, they sometimes escalate to the president of our company, who comes back to us and asks us why we weren't responsive to your emails. So it's definitely worth being bold and making an outreach and not being afraid to reach out to industry as your partner.
Yeah, I think that's clearly, you know, doing something along those lines, either having a for industry to sponsor sort of a reciprocal seminar, if you will, of what we have here. I think is a pretty attractive solution. I think we could get a pretty interesting audience. I think the other thing is to understand that there truly are nurses employed in industry. I mean, I don't know to what extent that's really clear to people. You know, I've worked for a lot of different companies, and I'll just sort of combine them all together rather than pick one company. But there are nurses that are doing that we used to call clinical specialists, that basically deal with at the research side, the R&D side, the development side, so they work hand in hand with the team. We need more of them. I'm hiring right now. It's just the pitch book. I don't want to take anybody away from a hospital, but okay. But seriously, people who basically come in, work hand in hand with the engineers, right? So I think understand that exists. It should exist more. I think all of us should be hiring more people in that role. Also, nurses work in a role for developing all of the manuals and documentation and so on, which I know nurses don't have the time to read. So I appreciate the catch-22 there. And lastly, they also do a lot of education, which I actually think is really the most important part. So nurses in industry, in fact, will be with maybe with the salespeople, but certainly with the installation people, basically to do the in-service training and so on. So I think part of it is just us educating what's available with the industry, and again, not to take any nurses out of the hospital, but to understand what the opportunities actually are in that role. So.
Go ahead.
Just one other thought, and it's one of the things that COVID has made very difficult, and that is actually going in and doing in-service training into hospitals. It's a lot more challenging than it was pre-COVID to even gain entry. And so just to bear in mind, it isn't that we don't want to be there or we don't want to be doing the education that's necessary, but sometimes industry partners, or not just industry, I mean, there's just basically a barrier to entry into hospitals for patient safety and staff safety purposes. So really bearing that in mind and trying to create opportunities to educate outside the walls of the hospital, I think, is another opportunity for us.
What has worked in my past life, not in this company yet, but is going by areas, centers of excellence or focus. Because when you think of, in the previous company, transducers and ultrasound, when you're thinking of anything to do with transducers, Penn State would come up like clockwork, right? Because there's a massive amount of research, faculty, and just number of alum working in that industry and that specialization. So that generally works really well, but it becomes a chicken and egg, right? How do you build a center of focus without getting the industry partnerships? And so the second element is finding local partners or local industry. Because what oftentimes happens is, especially if there's a large focus, like that on the biotech, med device, and the Eastern Coast, it germinates a whole ecosystem of support partners, right? And so any research, so first of all, you expand your opportunity for research and collaboration with these partners in the ecosystem, expands your paradigm, gives your students a lot more opportunity to expand all the facets or explore all the facets of what is around that specialized area. But then as a consequence, you may only attract certain sets of students, so it's a balance. But that has worked really well for us in the past. Again, you end up finding a lot of your partners, prospective research partners and all of that through research. Just Google. And I'm not just thinking of industry, I'm also thinking of a lot of the startups. There are a massive amount of startups right now in the space who don't know who to partner with, who are looking for these very types of research, know-how, expertise. And the only way they could do that is probably attend a few events and then start Googling, right, research.
Sorry. No, thanks. I don't know if I'm directly answering the question, but something that we've had, it's like you were talking about, we've had a lot of luck with nursing consultants internally that would work for our company 3-4 days a week, work in the hospital 1 day a week, and bring it so they're staying fresh with knowledge. We're not designing our products for these couple of nurses, but it's a good starting point. It's letting us do our risk assessments and some front-end work, and it's no substitute for going into the hospital. But industries need a steady influx of information, and the beginning of our design process is not talking to people and asking what they need, but watching what they need, because I think you said earlier that nurses don't always even know what's possible. So we need to understand, and maybe not yet go native, but we need to understand what's happening. So industry is always going to need that. There's always a demand for that, and it's even harder now with COVID to get access to the users and the patients and to understand the real unmet needs. But I think the internal consultants is another level up from getting a little farther but still having access. And so working those avenues could have a lot of opportunities. It'd be nice, IP and other things start to get in the way, but it would be nice to have even people from universities that can sit in a company and have dual appointments. I dream about someday doing I work in a company, but I dream about someday doing a quarter at a, I'm blanking on the word. It's it's not a vacation, but a sabbatical. Gosh, been out of academia too long. But, a sabbatical. And so some of these things aren't as institutionalized as they could be, but someday they might be. And we'll make better products and we'll have better collaborations for it.
This takes us to the final theme of today's discussion, which is growing complexity of healthcare technology. A couple of decades ago, the standard nursing kit might fit in a suitcase. Now it fills an entire room, right? And for everything, there is an app. So the question is, what's the balance between making technology easier to use or versus educating nursing professionals on the underlying technology? Like, how do we balance that? Love to hear from all of you.
It's an interesting way to say that in terms of a balance. I would argue that nurses drive and determine the usability. So I don't necessarily think it's that I need to teach a nurse all about the complexities of the device. Rather, I need to simplify the device to make it easy to use. It's not a reflection on anybody's knowledge. It's a reflection on workflow, on time. Nurses don't have the time, basically, to figure out how something works. We know they're overworked. They were terribly overworked during COVID. And this applies to all healthcare professionals. If you ever design something for an EMT use, these guys do not want to fool around with your new device, basically trying to get it to work. Okay, basically out dealing with or in a code situation in the hospital, for instance, right? So it's got to work first time every time, and so I think we just have to have that attitude that that's the nature of the devices. And yes, they're more complex, and yes, there's sort of an app for this and an app for that. But if it doesn't work in the care flow, and if people can't be expected to be, an expert in that area when it's got to work instantaneously. So.
My answer was going to start the same way, which is that, if you ask a nurse to press one more button or require 5 minutes of training, your product isn't going to get used. So. Maybe it's punting the question, but the design ideal is that it's very intuitive and it's not adding steps or training but I will say that the technology should, especially if it's something like an algorithm or something that is a complicated technology, it should be revealing behind the scenes how it's arriving to the outcome. We still need to provide the information so that the nurses with their clinical knowledge are able to exercise their judgment and not take that away. So I think that's the onus on the design. But any design that requires training for a nurse, I don't specifically on the technological part, I don't think is going to be successful.
Just to clarify, what I wish to communicate was two generations ago, there would be a physical sign and there would be a device that would share that information. Now there are several layers of abstraction that has been built into, and the abstraction is not always clear. In some cases, that abstraction has become a decision, right? So which means the underlying abstraction which is done by the technology is somewhat opaque because sometimes it might be proprietary. So then the question that comes up is we are relying on these technology to make clinical decisions, but the underlying abstraction might be complicated, might be complex. So how much does that need to be communicated, or how do we communicate it?
So, I look at this as two things. One is we won't belabor the discussion about alarms and nuisance alarms and so on. But I look at this as actionable events. So the system has to provide something that's an actionable event, and an actionable event is what it sounds like. Basically, it means that there's going to be something that's done with the patient, some therapeutic intervention, something that, or maybe the actionable event is just to take another lab draw and another set of vitals. That's still actionable. So I think that's the failure on the industry side, basically, to be able to clarify that. And then the second part of it is, I think there's a lot of talk on AI and sort of black box solutions, and there's a lot of algorithms that are being executed sort of underneath. And to what extent does a nurse or any clinician have to understand? And what my group actually does a bunch of that work, and I don't define it that way. I say that whatever algorithm we have, I have to explain to a clinician, whether it's a nurse or a physician, in simple terms, in terms of things that they're already doing. So if I have an algorithm that uses 25 different physiological input parameters, and one of them is weighted to 0.00005, I actually don't put it in, because I don't want to explain that to somebody, because it's not going to make sense that in this case potassium level actually has nothing to do with that disease. So I think it also behooves us to, even though we have the capability of being complex, for instance in the AI space, to actually have simplified algorithms, and maybe the AOC curve, if you will, if people know what the AOC curve is sort of a sense of being perfectly predictable or flipping a coin, is sort of the two extremes. Maybe the AOC isn't quite as good because you didn't put that variable in, but at least you can explain it to whoever you're talking with.
One of the things that I've been responsible for in my role is professional education, professional medical and professional clinical education. And I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it, particularly post-COVID, when we've looked at staffing shortages, when we've looked at travelers being exposed to different units and units where they may not be as comfortable or as well trained in others, and trying to be aware of that and provide training for those areas. But one of the things that we keep hearing repeatedly is that there's no time, that everyone has, what we've heard is 30 seconds. You've got 30 seconds to train someone how to operate your device. So we're in the midst right now of trying to create podcast series, both video and audio podcast series, where we take 30 seconds or 3 minutes or whatever it is to actually explain the device and how to use the device. But then there are accompanying podcasts that can go with that talk about the background, the physiology of the disease, or the physiology of the problem that this device is trying to treat, what these things mean, how to act when you see a particular signal from a device. So we're taking the complex and then carving it out into a series of trainings where a traveler could go without access to the internet, because sometimes on the units you don't have internet, but could go to the hospital server and take a variety of trainings to be able to understand not only how to use the device, but what the background physiology is, and how to act upon it and how to interpret what they're seeing. So hopefully that is answering some of your question, is that the layering is, in the spirit of lifelong learning, the layering and learning to use the device is just part of it, but refreshing what it is that you once learned and knowing how to do it better is part of the layers and part of what we're trying to accomplish with some of these micro-learning technologies.
Say one thing. Govind, I understand the question you're asking, and it's a very nuanced answer. The truth is the industry 100% believes that you have to create it with zero workflow disruption. The truth is also that it is impossible to do, like 99% of the time. Perhaps there are a few that work perfectly so. And so one of the technologies that I see, digital, right? The record, just everything being recorded, it creates some resistance I've seen, especially in the senior nurses. The new generation doesn't struggle with technology at all. They're used to it. But it so happens that and Joanna, you can sort of attest to that, right? Your senior nurses in your department leaders, they struggle with some of the new technologies, with the digital things which they're not native to, which they don't understand. The truth is, I believe, the sheer amount of data that is now going into the systems because of all the advent of digital technologies is going to be ripe for disruption, or there's going to be a lot of disruption coming because of that. But in order to do that, first you have to populate the data, get everything all digital, and that almost guaranteed introduces new headaches. Maybe different headaches, right? Maybe it reduces 5 steps to 2, but it's different set of things that you have to consider. And honestly, look, we understand our microcosm of the products that we sell or departments that we serve, but we don't 100% understand the entire ecosystem. So we might solve the issues here, but we may create a whole set of issues 5 steps down the line or 2 departments down, which we don't fully understand. Happens more often than you realize. And as a consequence, again, but in order to, we were talking about, Ellen and Steve were talking about patient flow, right? It's such a fundamental issue. But the reason I think it's ripe for disruption again is because the sheer amount of data that is flowing into the systems, and someone somewhere will crack it, given enough time. It's waiting for that.
Thank you for the robust discussion. Any closing remarks or thought? We got a couple of minutes between folks and their coffee.
Yeah, I wanted to say a few things. First, thank you all for this. This is a great program. Actually, you need to toot your horn even more because it is the only combination program in the U.S. like this. So I applaud you. So I think we should get more word out and so on. And I think I sort of have a feeling like everybody in the room kind of gets it. We kind of, in fact, when we were sending out questions back and forth, everybody said, well, yeah, of course, we agree with all that. So we have to do something a little bit beyond that in terms of communicating outside of this room. Of that synergy that you can really get the 1 + 1 = 3 notion. So.
Yep.
Thank you very much. That concludes the session. Oh, sorry.
First of all, I want to thank you all very much for participating. I think a lot of the success of our center here really partly hinges on our ability to transparently, ethically, and collaboratively interact with industry, because it's gone too far in one way where there's too much of a split between, for some very good reasons in the past, between how you're able to work with industry, and I think we need to break down some of those barriers. So we really appreciate you being here. And you also had a couple of really good ideas throughout the panel, or you made some comments about ways and programs that we might be able to do together. So do keep those in mind. Reach out to us. You know where we are, because we're really looking to try stuff. And if it doesn't work, fine. We'll try it again and again and again till we have a reproducible thing that works. And I'll give you the mic in a sec. But I do want to ask one question. One of the things that I noticed, I spent a lot of time in industry, as many of you know. Steve and I worked together over a decade on patient monitors. So I understand trying to create global products and that there's a lot of constraints and the buttons don't always belong in the same place in China as they do in the US. So that's okay. But I'd love to hear a few comments from folks about how you actually use nurses in this case, because we're talking about nursing products, in your disciplined way in your product development process, either as a member of the team, when the product looks like this blank piece of paper, or really disciplined iterative product development where you build a few pieces of functionality and you bring it out and you test it and you build a few, rather than what I've seen in the past is the product's practically done. You've done design lock on 50, 60, 70% of it. Then you ask the nurses and we give you feedback and say we can't do that. So I would love to hear, I hope that's changed some, so I'd certainly love to hear a little bit about your current experience or your current processes in that area.
I can share how ours works. So we start with ethnographic research. We call it immersion, where we shadow nurses. For our last hospital bed, we had like 500 hours of people shadowing nurses. And then we have early concepts that we have nurses, some that come back, boards of nurses that come back and follow us through the development cycle as we develop 3 or 4 prototypes. And then we have like 20 waves of usability testing with different products, different features in or out, depending on where we are in the cycle. And then we have embedded nurses as well. And it's all of that throughout that's important. And I think, the nurses are serial problem solvers and they MacGyver things, and but the engineers have the luxury of looking at the system level, and I think the two together work very well. And then the third part is the nurse is always the patient advocate. So having a nurse on your design team who's always not that the engineers don't care, but the nurses are a different level. And so that's, having that throughout the process is very important.
I can't say that I have witnessed nurse shadowing from the beginning of the product development process, which would be, that is the ideal, but particularly in this environment, as I said, it's pretty hard to get into a hospital to do that, although not impossible. What we do instead is, in addition to embedded nurses, we do a lot of focus groups at Nursing Professional Society meetings. So the American Medical Surgical Nurses Association, the Nurse Anesthetist Organization, the Critical Care Nurse Organization. We hold focus groups at professional society meetings where we actually demonstrate product and get feedback and try and implement those changes into our design process, design structure before lock. And that's primarily how we do it. In addition to our embedded nurses, I'll just tell a really quick story. We used to develop CPAP interfaces, and an engineer pulled me into his office one day and said, I've got the ideal CPAP interface. I wanted you to take a look at it. And it was, at that time, in reimbursement, there were, I think, 3 codes for reimbursement for a CPAP interface. And the particular product that they had developed had about 60 parts. It was fully customizable, but it had 60 parts, and it actually intubated the patient. And I said, have you tried this on yourself or any of your colleagues? He said, no, and I said, first thing, I would encourage you to do that. Go put this interface on your colleague and see how it works for them. And we did not move forward with that product, but I think that really always getting that insight is really critical to the development process.
Yeah, so I actually agree with your process. I can't claim that we actually use it in my current company, but I'm working on it. So I want to go down that path, both in terms of embedded nursing and also designing from, as described, from the whiteboard. That's one of the takeaways I will tell you for Zoom, et cetera. Maybe somebody knows a really good app to do this, but I think on a whiteboard, and I need that interaction. And to have a nurse and an engineer stand in front of a whiteboard and draw things and erase things, cross them out, and so on is a very dynamic. It's a great process to watch. And I've done it in past companies. I hope to bring it to my current company. You mentioned, we have to address global. So I work for a Japanese company, and I will tell you that I learned a lot about Japanese medicine and hospitals. Average length of stay there is almost, it's like 2 to 3 weeks. It's really amazing. So it's totally different dynamic, actually, than we have the US system, which is basically care for them and kick them out the door, which is also wrong in the other direction. But part of it is understanding that there are differences in how you design it at the system level, and maybe even at the instrument level about those differences. But I think in terms of the nursing input, the only thing I could say is the earlier the better. I have worked for a lot of companies. I won't name the particular products, but I can probably offline tell you a bunch of different devices that clearly did not have nurse input. One short story, I'm an engineer. We were developing a touch interface for a central station, and I thought, wow, what a cool idea. Why don't we, this is when touch was not, it was actually you broke a beam. So you had to break a beam, and I said, well, sometimes people miss the point, they don't quite hit right. So we'll write an algorithm that learns and figures out that you're always pressing to the right, and I'll just adjust it. Well, nurses come in different heights, and they're right-handed and left-handed. And it turns out that really cool engineering idea, got thrown out. Because it was used by people. Ultimately, in the end, we just sort of had to do the best we can with the touch interface. So.
Yeah, I think you'll hear similar stories, Karen. I think a lot of the large companies are either aware of it or have already introduced it. In our case, from the initial whiteboarding process to talking about the product concept to the wireframes and prototyping, and we have clinicians in-house who are basically already ED nurses in critical care. Our users tend to be that, right? So it would be foolish to not have them as part of the design process. But I'll give you a couple of examples. There was one ultrasound device that was being built with a monitor used to stand in portrait mode. It's so tall that the nurses can't see past it in ED when they're trying to push the device. Right? It's a major oversight if you think about it. We identified it because of clinician input. Similarly, I'm working with a startup led by physicians who we're talking about. They're laser focused on maximizing the value of the consumables, and they don't see it as a concern when the new variable that they're introducing would basically fall off the patient in less than a day. Do you have any idea what it would take for a nurse to not know that every day, within less than a day, they'd have to go change it? Oh, it's great. They'll be using more consumables. I wish they had a nurse on staff. So I think to kind of tell them, and so I'm trying to educate them, but the honest truth is physicians and even industry, right, they struggle until they hear straight from the horse's mouth. They struggle until, as what Neal said, is they actually observe it in the native environments. And so what I think is startups really don't have access to these types of resources because they can't afford them, or they don't think of them because of lack of experience, right? Perhaps serial entrepreneurs would. Those are the ones where I think you could, and there's a massive amount of investment and innovation that's happening in this world, which probably won't see light of day for, minor issues, you would say, design issues, but become major workflow issues down the line.
We have one question from the audience.
I have to tell you, I'm practically jumping out of my seat. I'm so enthusiastic about what this panel has covered. And I just had to give a couple pieces of feedback because I think you need to hear it. Girish gave probably what I consider the most succinct, comprehensible description of how when you invest in something today, X number of dollars, it's only worth so much several years out. That's like an insightful description of some of the difficulties that occur. Like you say, the more revolutionary it is, the longer it's going to take, yet it diminishing money. Mary had an extraordinarily good insight when you described, and of course it's flying out of my head just now because I'm trying to think of it, so I'll go to my third point. Neal talked about the overhead tracking system for ergonomics so people don't hurt their backs. My hat is off to Bay State because you're implementing that in your renovations, because as many times as you might try to tell the bean counters that nurses' aides hurting their backs or nurses hurting their backs, time off duty, workers' comp, is money you're spending. You could shift it over here and prevent all these injuries, and we would still have them on duty work. You can't get through them. They just don't want to hear it over the years, I found. But, oh, Mary's point just came to my mind. And you described that the amount of time being spent trying to develop an idea means that you can't just shift gears and go somewhere else. But I would have to say there's a mindset that industry needs to consider, because Ebola popped up out of nowhere, COVID popped out of nowhere, and everybody had to figure it out.
You're right.
So they had to MacGyver their way into solutions. So while what you're saying is understandable, and I get it, the fact of the matter is, out here in the practice world, we don't have that kind of luxury. And just as we have to be nimble, maybe industry, which they proved with the vaccinations for COVID, it's possible to do, but it's just not their normal way of doing things. But I have to tell you, I've been so inspired by this panel. I'm jumping out of my seat. Why I'm still sitting here, I don't know. Because I want to say, you've done a fantastic job, and you've inspired me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you want to do a picture?
Get a photograph down here. Sure.